Hello, my name's Dave, and today we'll be adding an Angular client to our newsfeeder API. You can check out my previous video where I go through and actually make the API. We're using the Go programming language for that, but today I'll be focusing specifically on the client. Okay, cool, let's get started. So where we left off, we have this folder, this newsfeeder folder, and this is for anyone tuning in now. This is an API which essentially just it's like a bulletin board newsfeed kind of concept where people can create newsfeed items and then they can read all of the newsfeed items. So we have this API. It's all contained inside of here, and let's sort of put this away into its own little project, and then we'll create a client. So I'll create a folder here called API, and I'm just gonna go ahead and dump the entire API into there. Cool. Now, in my terminal, I've previously added the Angular CLI. If you want to figure out how to do that, I'll leave a link in the description. And what you'll want to do is say ng new, and then we want to say the name of the project, and in this case it'll be news feeder. Now the CLI is going to ask us a bunch of questions. For the time being, we don't want any routing. We might add some later. We'll go with CSS for now. And it's just going to go ahead and install all of its dependencies, basically just doing its npm install. So we'll let it do its thing and give it a moment. Awesome, great. So the first thing we're going to do from here is rename, whoops, not going to compress it, we don't need to do that. We're going to rename the newsfeeder, I'm just going to call it client. And I'm going to open this newsfeeder folder in Visual Studio Code. I've got both the API and client opened here. I'm just going to make a makefile, tie this whole thing together. And in the makefile, we'll specify the rules later, but basically that's it. And now I'll just open the client in Visual Studio Code. Okay, for anybody unfamiliar, this is an Angular project. We have our source code which defines our application. And outside of here, we've just got some basic configuration. Anybody familiar with any Node projects from before would recognize this file. It's a package JSON. It ties together our dependencies and our development dependencies. We have some TypeScript configuration. This basically tells the compiler, the TypeScript compiler, how to read our files and what features we'll enable, for example, experimental decorators. And we've got some linting rules, which probably has semicolons somewhere, hopefully not. In any case, if it does, we'll disable them later. This Angular JSON defines, it talks to the Angular CLI, and it tells it how to compile the project. It gives it the project name, newsfeeder, and then it'll sort of give you an output path. We'll have where the index HTML is, and it'll compile and put everything together. And that's pretty cool. Great, so from here, we have this source folder with the app. Let's get oriented with everything. In Angular, everything begins with this module. A module sort of ties together all of these different components and different dependencies in the project. If you have pages, which are just components, if you have components, you can use services, which are effectively singletons, which can be dependency injected into either components or other services. And there are other things like other modules can be loaded into modules, and you can sort of bring the dependencies over from other modules. You have pipes and directives, which are effectively, directives are HTML attributes which declaratively modify the behavior of an element, and pipes are modifiers to values that you place in templates. So I'll probably show you how that works later, but for now, that's basically what this does. We're saying we're bootstrapping this app component when the application is loading, And then we're declaring this app component as well. We're saying this is part of our main module, our app module. This app component is being imported from here, which is this app component file here. And if we look at it, it now composes itself by saying, my name is approot. This component, its selector, its HTML tag is approot. It refers to an HTML file, which is this file here. It's got a style URL, which is the CSS file, which is here. And we have a test file, which defines a bunch of tests, which we can use to make sure that everything's operating. But for now, we're just going to remove the tests, just to keep this a little bit cleaner, and we'll proceed with that. If we look at our index.html, we'll see we have approot, which actually is in fact this approot here. And so that's being pushed into this HTML body. Great, so let's start the project. Now what we want to do is npm run start in the client folder. Now this will bring up Webpack, it'll set up all the compiling features, and it'll also bring up a dev server, which will serve the application as well as hot reload whenever we make changes. So let me just grab a browser. So here we have a browser, and if I go to localhost 4200, we'll see that it says welcome to Newsfeeder, and then a bunch of basic stuff. Now if we take a look at the app component, we can see welcome to title. Here are some links to help you start. And if we look at this HTML, welcome to title, here are some links to help you start. But where does title come from? Title comes from the TypeScript relating to this component. So this component saying my HTML is located in this file, and I have a bunch of information, some data that exists inside of me, and Angular will then render it inside of this HTML file. Now if we put them side by side, gives it a little bit more context. We can see that this title property is actually bound to this title property here. So if I change this to newsfeeder and we go back here, we'll see this automatically refresh. Hopefully, if not, just do it manually. And it should automatically refresh, but you know, whatever. It'll recompile automatically at the very least, and we've got this update here. Now, a cool thing about Angular, the whole point of Angular is it's got this thing called two-way data binding. And what that means is anytime this text changes, or anytime the value of this variable, which is bound to the template, anytime this value changes, the template will automatically re-render, and this value will be updated in the rendered HTML in the DOM. So if we use an ng on init hook, so what this is this is a method that it's a lifecycle hook on this component. If we console.log, we can see that in the console, my console log has occurred. And what this does is basically when the component is rendered, when it gets created, run this hook, and that's all it's doing here. So what we'll do is we're going to create a set timeout just to prove that this data binding thing works, and we'll take the value of this dot title and we'll update it and say, hey, it's been updated. And we'll do that after 2 seconds. So now let's just jump back here. 1, 2, there you go. And so it automatically updates. Angular, the framework itself, it will actually automatically re-render this template after it notices that this HTML, that this property in this class relating to this HTML has updated. So that's kind of the power of Angular. That's why people like it. That's the value proposition here. Cool. Now, there are ways to work with this change detection to make it more efficient. And one way you can do that is you can use something called the change detection strategy. So if we go ahead and use change detection, there's a property on this component's decorator in the config for this decorator, and it is change detection. And we can actually set a change detection strategy of either default, which will re-render anytime any property changes, or if we do on push, it'll only re-render if an input, a property input, changes. So if we see here, 2 seconds have happened, but nothing is updated on the element. If we go ahead and console log hello, it's gonna go in 1, 2, hello, but nothing is updated, even though the data has changed. And the reason for this is when writing components, a lot of the time you don't really care if the internal state changes, but what you do care about is whether or not the properties change. I think in React they call this pure components. And so this effectively turns this component into a pure component where it'll only re-render if the input properties change. Now we'll work with input properties later, but just a quick dive in there. Great, so let's delete everything. Have a look, and there should be nothing. And we'll get rid of this change detection strategy. Now, what are we trying to achieve here? What we want to do is we have this API, and we want to be able to talk to this API from our client. The first challenge here is how do we even get the client to communicate to the API on the same domain? Don't really want to mess with cores or anything like that. We want to say something like, if you imagine we've got like our local host, and then we want to say /API and take API, anything past API, send it to this service. So how do we do this? Conveniently, Webpack and by extension Angular have the capability to use a proxy config, I think .json. Let me just double check. Let me pull out a reference. Okay, cool. So there is in fact a proxy config.json, and we've got a bunch of rules that we want to define. The first rule being API /star. So anything going to API star, we want to apply these proxy rules to it. We've got a target, and the target is the URL of the application, so the server, and our server will be located on localhost 5000, and there are a few other properties. Secure will be whether or not we would like to enforce an HTTPS connection. Log level is how much logging we want to see. In our case, we want to see, let's do debug. Oopsie. And change origin, we want to set that to false. Cool. Now in our package JSON, we've got our ngserve on the start command, and we want to change this to include the proxy config, and that looks like proxy-config, and then we point to the config, so that's a proxy.config.json. And now if we go back to our service, stop it, and restart it, our service should launch with that new proxy configuration. Cool. Now if we go to our browser, type in /API, it's going to say error occurred because our other service is not running. So let's go ahead and fix that. Let's open up and split this vertically. So on the left, we'll have our client. On our right, we're going to have our server. Whoopsie, that's not the one. I think it's set to 8080 currently, so let's go ahead and change that. So we want to set the URL to be 0000, so any your incoming request domain, and we'll also set it on port 5000. Okay, and we'll go ahead and make dev. So now we're listening on 5000. We should probably add a ping. Oh, we have one. Of course, because we also need to add API to our API. So we have to create a group. So this will be r.group, and our group will be API. And we use a shadow, like variable shadowing here, and say API, make dev. And now it'll start it all up on this /API/ everything else. And if we go back here, hello, found me. Great. So now on our Angular server, we're now proxying our requests to our own backend, which is great. Now we need to actually, get things from it. So the first thing we want to do is just define a component, make something look roughly how we want to see in news items. So we want to have a post name. We'll just make a bunch of divs for now. We can clean it up later. Title and post. Cool, so we've got title and post. Now we'll want to replace these with the title and post of each of the individual posts we get from the API, but we actually haven't made any requests to the API, so we don't know what these values will be. So for now, we're going to mock these values. So I'm going to create a public variable, and I'm going to call it news feed items, and it's going to be an array. I'm going to declare an interface here, and we'll call it newsfeed item. And we'll have two properties. One will be post, and one will be title. I think I've been doing too much Go. Yeah, cool. So we have this newsfeed item interface defined, and we'll say that these newsfeed items are an array of newsfeed item interfaces. So that's cool. We've sort of typed this, and now we know what to expect on the client. Great. But we want to add some mock items just for the sake of it, right? At least just for the beginning. So we'll say title, hello, post, first post, then title, another one, post another value. And now on the HTML, what we can do is use something called a structural directive. And we can say ng4, and we can say let newsfeed item of newsfeed items. And we'll say newsfeed item dot title and newsfeed item dot post. What this is doing is we're creating a for loop of these newsfeed items here, and we're creating every iteration of the for loop. We create this newsfeed item, which is the current item that we're looping against, and we can then use it inside of this declaration between where the ng4 has been declared, between the open and closing brackets of the element it was declared on. And so what I'm saying is, in this current loop cycle, take the newsfeed items title and its post value and paste it in here. And what the renderer will do behind the scenes is for each individual item, it'll create one of these elements, but it'll do so in the DOM. So we declare it, and then in the DOM, it'll render based on the value of the incoming data that we have. And in our case, we've just got the static value, but eventually we're going to wire this up to our servers. And for the sake of, just gonna add a break. So we could say first post, second post, and third post. Cool. We eventually want to get this information from the API, but for now we're just going to use this mock data. The next thing we want to do is we want to add the ability for a user to add a post. And how are we going to do that? We're going to add a button, and in this button it's going to say add post. Maybe we want to create something of an interface for this, so let's make this a little bit more palatable. We have add post, we'll create a div here, and we'll create a div beneath it. We have an input type text and an input of type text. We want some sort of like title above it. We'll create another div, and we'll call it, let's say title. And another div, we'll call it post, and then here we'll have some placeholders. Enter your post, and then up here we'll have placeholder, enter your title. Now if we go up into here, we'll see enter your post, enter your title, and that's the top part. Now we'll add some spacing the good old-fashioned way. Cool, so now we have this area up above where you can add posts, and then below we'll actually have the posts. Eventually, what we're going to eventually do is have this submit a post to the API and have this obtain its information from the API. But right now we haven't, so we're just going to write some methods. Well, write some methods which will just be operating on our client, and we'll wire it up later. So we want to say add post. And what's this going to do? We've got a couple of ways we can do this. There's a very simple way, which I'm kind of inclined to do, but I'll show you the data binding method as well. Actually, we'll just go with the data binding method, seeing as it's probably the most recommended. What we'll do is we have two properties. We got title, and it equals nothing at the beginning. And we have post, and that also equals nothing. Both of these are public. They're public by default, but I do like to explicitly state that they're public. And then what we want to do is say newsfeed this.newsfeedItems.push. We're going to add an item to it. It's going to be an object, and the object matches that signature from the interface. and the value that we'll have will be the values of this .title, and the post will be the value that we get from this .post. Then we're going to set this .title, and we're going to change its value to nothing, and then this .post, and we'll change its value to nothing. So what we're doing, I'll remove these for now, but what we're doing here is when you click the add post button, on click of it, run this add post function, this add post method, and it'll push an item to this array, and that item will contain the value that is stored in these two variables. Now we can actually bind these two variables to the template, and we do that using these directives, ng model, and we point it to title. So we're saying this input box will always be the same value as the value that I've declared, and that's title. Cool. Now let's have a look. It's going to give me an error. It's going to say ng module is not a part of input. It's not a known property of input. Now the reason for that is Angular is a very big framework, and it provides a lot of smaller components and bits and pieces that you can opt in to use. And one of the features that you can opt in to use is this ng module. Sorry, this ng model, and you can get that from importing a module from at Angular/forms. Now there's a package in this forms module called the forms module. If we take that and import it, what we're doing is importing all of the dependencies that this package has, this module has. Probably won't be able to see anything here, but whatever the case, when we go ahead and add values now, it'll add an item, and we can continue to add items. It's not clearing the text, however, and in order to do that, after setting the value, after pushing a value to that array, we should clear the values of these properties. And now when I type in and create a post, it'll clear the values. Awesome. Cool. I think we're ready to wire this up to the API. In fact, let's get started on that. So the first thing we want to do is we want to import the HTTP module from Angular. It's got a common, it's a HTTP package, and from there we can get the HTTP module, HTTP client module. And so now we're importing another dependency, another module, which itself contains a bunch of services and some utilities that we can use and leverage to build our application out. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to import the HTTP client. And so the same place, we're going to go to Angular common /HTTP, and we're going to grab the client. Now we're using Angular's dependency injection here, and it looks like this. We're saying we're creating an HTTP client variable in our service, and that variable is equal to a singleton value of this HTTP client class. Now we can use this HTTP client to actually do stuff. So we can say this dot HTTP client dot post, and we have /API /newsfeed, I believe, is the endpoint. So we've got a post on newsfeed and a get on newsfeed. Post on newsfeed what's it saying? Wants 2 arguments. We have to pass in a body, and the body is the value that we were previously pushing to this array. And we can async this and to promise that. Then clear the values from this.post and this.title. Now we probably want to load these values in from the API as well, and we can do that by effectively doing the same thing, but I'll create a little file, a little method, and I'm going to call it load news items, and we're going to await a this.http .get, and we're going to get from the API / newsfeed. And what do we get from it? We have results. However, we really just want to set these results directly onto this newsfeed item, so we're just going to say this.newsfeed items equals the results, and we actually need to type the return value coming in from this get request to say we're getting an array of newsfeed items. What's it complaining about? Is missing the following properties. Oh, right, because it's an observable. To promise. Awesome. Cool. So we await the HTTP request. It's going to return an array of newsfeed items, which I believe matches the signature of the original API request. So let's see. We have yep, so title and post. I think that was what it looked like. Title and post. Yep. And we can delete these 2. Now we have load news items and get and post news items. Great. Now we want to implement the ng on init, which we're going to have to import manually from Angular core. Maybe I spelled that wrong. Oh, sorry, it's just on init. Then we need to add a method here called ng on init, and in that method, make it an async method. In that method, we're going to say this dot load items. Wait, we're not doing anything after this, so in fact we probably don't even need to do this, but we'll do it anyways. Now, after we add these posts, we probably want to refresh our feed just to make sure that whatever we've added is actually represented. It's actually loaded, it's up there. So we'll do this whole this dot add, load new items, and we'll await that before clearing everything out. Okay, let's have a look. So looks like we've got no compile errors. We've got this guy complaining about something. Let's just clear it out. Now we'll have this sitting down the bottom. Grab our client up here. Now obviously refresh, and let's see. So we have just done an API get request to newsfeed. So obviously it tried to retrieve the values there. Nothing is there because we don't have any news items yet. Add an item. Now we have a title and a post. We've done a post request to newsfeed, and we got a return on this API get. Now if we keep adding items, you can see that it keeps happening. Now if we were to go to localhost 5000 /API/news feed, we'll see all of these items have been added, and we can hit the API directly. In addition, we can also use the proxy and talk to the same endpoint, which is cool. But effectively, we're illustrating here that this is being stored offsite, off the client, and it's being stored in a server, and that server is actually retaining that information, and you can reuse it between different clients. And we can actually demonstrate the between different clients part. We can say, hey, look, we have the same newsfeed items. Now, you can obviously see these aren't syncing. If I was to refresh the other one, of course, we'd see an update, but when I update one, it doesn't automatically push a change to another. That's an entirely different way, entirely different problem. Something you could probably deal with simply, but not recommended, with a set interval. And you could simply do something like this, where you await, where you dispatch and you get request every 2 seconds or something like that, and will absolutely spam our server with these get requests. And now anytime I make a change after 1 second, at the most 1 second, you'll have to wait before the other service is updated. But that's not ideal. It's obviously load on the server. It doesn't really need to be this way. You can use other solutions, something like WebSockets or long polling or something else. But in our case, we're just using an actual polling method. And yeah, so that concludes my video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Like it if you liked it. If you don't, you know what to do. Cool. Thanks, everybody. Take care.